is the end of the year. Believe it or not, as I talked about in our children's time, we don't normally get to talk about the end of the year because this Sunday is usually the Sunday that our confirmation students present their testimonies of faith. Just a year ago, our confirmation students were up here on this Sunday giving their testimonies of faith. But this year, since we don't have a class being confirmed this year, we are observing the significance of this day on the ecumenical Christian calendar, the last Sunday in the 2015-2016 church year, the end of the year. Next Sunday, you're going to see a tree here. It's the beginning of Advent. We usually have Confirmation Sunday on that day for a specific reason, because next Sunday is the beginning of the year. The first Sunday of Advent is the first Sunday of the Christian year, and when we confirm our students on that day, we are telling them that confirmation is not the end, but a beginning. It's the beginning of your journey as communicant Christians with the wider body of Christ, and the beginning of a great journey that you will all continue on for the rest of your lives, growing in faith ever closer to God. Next year, on this Sunday, our current confirmation class, who are all studiously sitting there taking notes on the sermon, will be up here presenting their testimonies of faith. We actually have 10 wonderful confirmation students in our class, and they are all opening up their faith about how God is moving in their lives. I have no doubt that their testimonies next year on this Sunday will be stellar. And as they are confirmed the next Sunday, on the first Sunday of Advent, and we tell them that it's the beginning of their journey and not the end, I have every confidence that they will continue to embrace their faith and grow and develop as Christians in the world. But today we celebrate the last Sunday of the year. This Sunday has been labeled by those who label such things as Christ the King Sunday, or Reign of Christ Sunday. It's a Sunday that we reflect on Christ's end, just as we begin to prepare ourselves to reflect on Christ's birth. It's a Sunday that we think about the dynamic between endings and beginnings, realizing that even just when we think things are at their lowest, a new beginning is just around the corner. Just when we think we are defeated, victory is just around the corner. Just when we think the forces of crucifixion have won, resurrection is just around the corner. Christ the King Sunday, or Reign of Christ Sunday, is a day when we contemplate the reality that no matter what the world throws at us, the good news of Jesus Christ will prevail. This is what Christ the King Sunday is about. Just when we think everything is ending, God says, look, I am doing a new thing. The idea of the dynamic between endings and beginnings is lifted in both of our scriptures today. The end is seen in the book of Jeremiah. You'll recall, as I mentioned last week, that one of the most formative events in the history of both the Christian and the Jewish faiths was the destruction of Israel in 587 BC. After decades of war, invading Babylonians finally conquered Israel, invaded Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple. God's followers, the Jewish people, were taken into slavery in Babylon. With the temple destroyed, the remaining Israelites could no longer worship because they believed that God lived in God's temple. The captured Jews could no longer worship as they were far, far away and could no longer make pilgrimages to the temple. Their entire religion was in disarray. Their faith was in shambles. It was in this environment that last week Isaiah wrote. This week we're hearing from Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote the wisdom that we heard today. Jeremiah wrote as the invasion was happening, or just before it was happening, and tells us that even in the midst of destruction and disarray, God is still doing a new thing. Speaking as God's oracle, Jeremiah says, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the lands where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will raise up shepherds who will guide them, and they shall not fear any longer, says God through God's servant, Jeremiah. Even when their world was falling apart, even in the midst of defeat and destruction, God will do a new thing. In the good news of God's steadfast love for all of God's children, no matter who they are or where they are on life's journey, will continue to grow stronger, even in the midst of defeat. Now, of course, we know this to be true. After 50 years of exile, the Jewish people return and rebuild their country once more, and their faith. Today, the Jewish people remain strong in faith, while the Babylonian Empire isn't heard of much. The end is never the end for God's children. In fact, it is just the beginning. The gospel lesson that Jan read makes this point even more faithfully in the message from the foot of the cross. This gospel reading is one that I often share at funerals because it in reality is a celebration of the promises of new life. It is the distillation of the promises that Jesus shares with us, the promises of new life and resurrection. This passage happened at the time of the crucifixion. After being humiliated and defeated, Jesus is hanging on the cross with criminals hanging on either side of him. Now, you know, crucifixion was a very ignorant way to die in Jesus' time. Common criminals sentenced to death were typically stoned to death or killed swiftly in some way or another. Crucifixion was a slow, agonizing torture reserved for only the worst criminals. To be sentenced to crucifixion was not justice in any fashion or shape, but a means of vengeance exacted by a hateful judiciary. Jesus was not just being killed. He was serving as an example to anyone who would question authority, who would stand up against the old guard and the way things have always been done. We understand, we know that Jesus did nothing wrong, other than to suggest that it might be cool if we would be nice to one another for a change. The criminals hanging on either side of him, however, must have committed some very serious crimes. The one on the right even admits to it, saying, "Indeed, we have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds." He must have been quite a bad man. But then, regarding Jesus, the criminal says, "But this man, Jesus, he has done nothing wrong." He then professes his faith when he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now we know the rest of the story. We have 2,000 years of faith development to finish this story for us. We know that the end was just the beginning for Jesus. We know that even in defeat, Jesus rose to victory. We know that Jesus showed us that there is a place for us after death, and that when our bodies are finally defeated by the ravages of time here on earth, we ascend to glory with Jesus and even with that criminal who was hanging on the cross next to Jesus. We know that if that criminal can be redeemed and saved and assured of spending an eternity with Jesus that very afternoon, that there is hope for each one of us as well, and that our end is just our beginning. We will all spend eternity with Jesus, no matter who we are, where we are in life's journey, or how God created us. We are saved. And yet, we often live our lives as if we are preparing for the end, not the beginning. We live our lives as Israelites mourning the end, not as people searching for a new beginning. We live our lives like the criminal hanging on Jesus' left. Oh, maybe we don't deride Jesus like that criminal did, but we often deride his message of love and peace and humility and acceptance of everyone. We often live our lives like that criminal on the left, rather than living like the criminal on the right, who believed with his whole heart that that crucifixion event was not the end. It was the beginning. We often live our lives as common people, when Jesus calls us to live our lives as kingdom people. Stop mourning the end. Rejoice in the new beginning. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, "Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your sting? Where, O death, is your victory? The sting and death and power and of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory. Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in God's work, because you know that your labor is not in vain. That challenge is ours as well, to be immovable, steadfast in God's work, not the work of the world, because those who labor in God's work never labor in vain. Our world has seen many contemporary heroes who have given themselves to God's work, succumbing to defeat only to have victory be theirs. The most prominent of these figures would be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who dedicated his life and sacrificed his life for the cause of civil rights. Most people associate Dr. King with the phrase, "I have a dream," but don't meditate on what that dream was. His dream was simple, that all may be one, echoing Jesus' dream articulated in John chapter 17, verse 22, when Jesus prayed to God for unity before being betrayed and led to death. Jesus prayed for unity, as did Dr. King. Addressing his followers in Memphis, Dr. King spoke about threats he had received on his life, and he urged them to continue their struggle for justice and peace, no matter what happened to him. On April 3rd, 1968, he addressed a crowd saying, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We have some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would love to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will." The next day, he was assassinated. But the end was not the end, it was a beginning. The assassination of Dr. King 48 years ago galvanized his message with Americans, black and white, who believed in justice, who believed in righteousness, who believed in shalom, who believed that Jesus' message of unity was not just for people who lived 2,000 years ago, but was still speaking in their world as well. They continued the fight for equality, and the fight continues today. A similar story centers around Oscar Romero, a Roman Catholic priest in San Salvador who was killed in 1980 for standing up for social justice. Romero was a common Roman Catholic priest who was part of the bureaucracy and part of the corruption that was oppressing and even killing God's children in El Salvador, until he witnessed a very horrible human rights violation. He was eventually elevated to archbishop, and he began speaking out against poverty, against social injustice, against government-sponsored assassinations and torture. He received many death threats, but he continued his stand for justice, righteousness, and shalom. He continued to be a proponent of the good news of Jesus Christ, Jesus' message of unity and love. He was threatened many times, but he continued to excel in God's work, as Paul said. Finally, one day, Bishop Romero, after giving a sermon speaking out against social injustices in his country, he was presiding over the communion table. He elevated the wafer, the host, offering thanks to God, and as he raised the wafer that would be used for communion that Sunday, on March 24th, 1980, he was shot. He collapsed on the communion table. But that wasn't the end of his cause. Romero became a martyr for the principles he held dear, the good news of Jesus Christ. His followers were fruitful and multiplied, to quote Jeremiah today. The oppressive regime that Romero spoke out against was exposed and overturned. Bishop Romero was elevated to sainthood, and at the ceremony, honoring him and commemorating his beatification, an estimated 250,000 people attended. It had to be held in an outdoor plaza in San Salvador. His death was just the beginning, and his fight for justice continued. So today is the end for us, the end of the year. Next Sunday is a new beginning. Next Sunday we begin contemplating Jesus' birth in our midst once more as we celebrate the first Sunday of Advent. Today we observe the end. But there's a reason this Sunday is called Christ the King Sunday. Because in the end, despite all of our petty politics and rhetoric, despite racism and sexism and divisions that seem all too prevalent in human society, in the end, Christ is the King. In the end, for Christians, Jesus is all that matters. Following Jesus, we know that in the end, God is what matters. Perhaps you saw the sign outside of some churches during the election season that read, "No matter who wins the election for president, Christ is king." So putting aside everything else in life, in the end we rededicate ourselves to a new beginning, immovable, steadfast in God's work, not the work of the world, because those who labor in God's work never labor in vain. Amen.